Aethelred the Unready was born in around 966, the son of King Edgar the Peaceful, and his third wife, Elfrida. In 975, Aethelred's father died, and the throne passed to Edward, Aethelred's half brother. Still only a child, it's doubtful that Aethelred had even the slightest inclination as to what lay in store for him in just a few short years. In 978, King Edward was murdered, possibly on the orders of Elfrida, his own stepmother. The throne now passed to the 12-year-old Aethelred. William of Malmesbury says this of Aethelred: his life is said to have been cruel in the beginning, wretched in the middle, and disgraceful in the end. Thus, in the murder of Edward, to which he gave his concurrence, he was cruel, base in his flight and effeminacy, and miserable in his death. These are stinging words from William, but only partially true. It is hardly fair to lay the blame for a political murder at the door of a young boy. The 20th century historian Frank Stenton suggests that the plot to kill Edward was formulated and carried out by the men in Aethelred's household, and he suggests there is insufficient evidence to support the claim that Elfrida was involved. However, it seems to me that Elfrida is unlikely to have been unaware of a plot against the king, her stepson, being formed by men close to herself and Aethelred. Whether she was directly involved or not, it would seem that Elfrida would have had few qualms about the murder, as it would elevate her own power and influence. Curiously, William of Malmesbury almost immediately contradicts his own claim that Aethelred was somehow complicit in Edward's murder. William tells how he read stories and heard rumours that Aethelred, on hearing of Edward's death, wept relentlessly. Elfrida became so irritated by her son's tears that she gave him a ferocious beating. Perhaps, as another modern historian suggests, Aethelred's sorrow was not only brought on by the grief he felt for Edward, but for the fact he knew that he was about to have the great burden of kingship thrust upon his young shoulders. So it was that Aethelred, reluctant or otherwise, became king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles states, Aethelred was hallowed king on the Sunday, the fortnight after Easter, at Kingston upon Thames. And there were, at his hallowing, two archbishops, including Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, and one of the great men of his age, and 10 bishops. His father, Edgar, had enjoyed a peaceful reign, which Aethelred could only dream of. During Edgar's reign, England had enjoyed a period of respite from the harrowing Viking raids that had dogged the country for so long. Unfortunately for the young king, that respite would not be permanent. Within just a couple of years of Aethelred becoming king, the devastation that followed a Viking raid returned with a vengeance. In 980, the south coast of England was violently attacked. In the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, Southampton was ravaged by a raiding ship army, with most of the town dwellers killed or taken prisoner. The following 2 years saw Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall plundered, and it wasn't just the south that suffered. In the north, in 980, Cheshire had also been attacked. If Aethelred had indeed been reluctant to take the crown, then whatever his fears had been had now surely intensified. However, the raids, for the time being, were isolated, and so far, at least, not a terminal problem for Aethelred and his kingdom. But in such a climate of fear and uncertainty, Aethelred, in the 980s, began to try and assert a sense of authority over his kingdom by moving away from the influence of his mother and other close advisers, and instead took the counsel of men of his own choosing. However, Whether Aethelred now felt he was mature enough to make his own decisions, he demonstrated in 986 that his judgment was not particularly good. Now aged about 20, the king became embroiled in a dispute with the Bishop of Rochester. According to Solcard of Westminster, writing a century later, Aethelred had granted an estate to one of his soldiers, but this had been rejected by the Bishop of Rochester, as it came under his jurisdiction. Having first laid siege to Rochester, Aethelred then proceeded to sack the surrounding areas. For this, the young king earned himself a severe rebuke from Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. That lack of judgment would afflict Aethelred throughout his reign. From what should have been a relatively minor incident, he had overreacted massively. Just 2 years later, in 988, after a few years of relative calm, the Viking raids would be renewed. Again, the southwest came under fire, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles describes. Watchet in Somerset was ravaged. Goda, the Devonshire thane, was killed, and many died with him. From that, we can deduce that an English army had been assembled to resist the raiders, but had clearly been unsuccessful and sustained heavy losses. That same year, Dunstan died and would be replaced as Archbishop of Canterbury by Cedric. The raids continued. In 991, the Vikings ravaged Kent and East Anglia before they were eventually joined in battle by an English army at Malden in Essex. The English, led by the Ealdorman of Essex, Byrhtnoth, were defeated, with Byrhtnoth himself killed. By this point, there was a growing desperation on the part of Aethelred and his court. The English had tried to defeat the Vikings in battle and had failed dismally, whilst the raiders continued to inflict untold damage on the country and its population. So, what other options did Aethelred have? Well, his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Cedric, came up with an idea. That was to pay the Vikings off. This was a tactic that had been employed before against the Vikings. In the previous century, the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, had done the same thing. However, if Aethelred wanted long-lasting peace, there would need to be an alternative to bribery. All bribery would do, especially when it came to the Vikings, was buy a king a little time. Once these ferocious warriors saw that you were willing to pay them once, they knew they'd be able to force you to pay them again, with increasingly intense raiding. As dim as Aethelred appears to be at times, it seems that even he recognised some of the shortcomings of paying Danegeld to the Vikings. To provide security for his subjects, keep his throne, and indeed perhaps even save his own life, then Aethelred must be prepared to wage war. The following year of 992, Aethelred gathered together a fleet of ships, hoping to catch the raiders unaware. He trusted the command of the fleet to be led by Aelfric, Ealdorman of Hampshire, and Thored, Ealdorman of East Anglia. However, Aethelred's plans were thwarted by the treachery of Aelfric. Aelfric, in contact with the Vikings, warned them of the king's plans, and they were able to slip away before any damage could be done. Aethelred's fleet was then ambushed and destroyed by the raiders. This must have been a hugely demoralizing episode for Aethelred. In revenge, the king ordered Aelfric's son to be blinded, but this would not put a stop to the treachery in Aethelred's kingdom. In 993, the Vikings caused more havoc in the north, plundering across Northumbria. Again, Aethelred attempted to raise an army against them, and again he was foiled by treachery. The commanders of the army fled before even setting off. Allegedly, this was because they were of Scandinavian descent, which would raise the question, why would Aethelred give the command of the army to men of such questionable loyalty? Not only does Aethelred clearly have a problem with inspiring any sort of loyalty that his forefathers had been so brilliant at, his decision making was, frankly, absolutely abysmal. In 994, led by the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, the Vikings laid siege to London but were met with stiff resistance and beaten back. The determination to fight was clearly there with the English population, but what the country needed was a king, or at least a commander, who was able to form a coordinated and organized resistance, which Aethelred was plainly not capable of doing, and, as it appeared, nor were any of the men around him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles despairs of the weakness of the English response. It says, an army was often gathered against them, the Vikings, but then as soon as they should have come together, something always started a retreat. It's easy to point the finger of blame at Aethelred, but clearly there was a lack of courage amongst the English nobility at this particular time. In 999, the men of Kent showed the sort of bravery that was required by marching out against the raiders, but according to one version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, they were lacking in support and, as had been the case with earlier English armies, had been forced to retreat and then flee. Aethelred, all the while, continued to use bribery and repeatedly found it didn't work. He had bribed a Dane named Palig to join his services and, no doubt, provide crucial information on the raiding army. Palig had been presented with manors and vast amounts of gold and silver in order to secure his loyalty. But he was the brother-in-law of King Sweyn. If Aethelred thought he could rely on him long term, he was sorely mistaken. In 1001, Palig predictably abandoned the English king. Aethelred wouldn't forget this, and Palig would be killed in the dramatic events of the following year. In 1002, in what is known as the St. Brice's Day massacre, Aethelred ordered any Danes living in England to be killed. The E version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles states that this was because a plot had been formed against the king's life. The reality was, it was because Aethelred and his advisors had failed dismally to protect the country, and this was Aethelred's last resort in responding to the Vikings. Attempts to resist militarily had been a disaster, bribery a predictable failure. What was left now was indiscriminate slaughter of Danes living peaceably in England. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but it seems Sweyn's sister and her husband were killed, which only served to make Aethelred's problems even worse, as the Danes, led by Sweyn, renewed their raids with renewed vigour. Inexplicably, Aethelred continued to rely on the services of Aelfric, that duplicitous ealdorman. In 1003, Aelfric feigned illness, instead of leading the army that Aethelred had left in his charge. In 1004, in East Anglia, Aethelred's advisors again attempted to pay Sweyn off, and again it almost immediately backfired. He took their money and promptly marched on Thetford. Led by a man named Ulfsvitel, the English picked up their swords and rode out to meet the Vikings, and a bloody battle ensued, with many falling on both sides. The following years continued in much the same vein. Sporadic, disorganized resistance from the English failed to stop the Viking progress, with the raiders doing as they pleased. In 1005, with so much burning of land taking place, it was hardly a surprise when famine set in, which the Anglo-Saxon chronicles described as such as no one ever remembered so grim before. In 1007, Aethelred held a meeting with his councillors, and the best they could come up with, yet again, was further payment of Danegeld. However, Aethelred, hoping this had brought him some time, used the grace period to build new warships and gathered them together at Sandwich in Kent, hoping he could protect the English coast. However, disharmony was never far away in the English ranks, and accusations of treachery broke out. A brother of the infamous Edric Striona, who himself would prove to be a great traitor to Aethelred's son Edmund Ironside, started picking a fight with a man named Wulfnoth, and made off with a large number of ships, which were then destroyed by a terrible storm, with Wulfnoth helping to finish them off. What remained of the fleet sailed back to London, Aethelred's plans abandoned. Soon the raiders would once again appear menacingly approaching the English shoreline. In 1011, the Vikings stormed into Canterbury and seized Aethelred, the archbishop, taking him hostage. Aethelred was clearly a brave man and refused to be ransomed. He at least recognised that paying the Vikings served no purpose other than to enrich them and impoverish England. He was willing to pay with his own life to prove the point. In 1012, in a drunken stupor, a group of Vikings killed the brave archbishop. But King Aethelred was now on borrowed time, and that time soon ran out. In 1013, he was forced to flee to Normandy, to the court of the Duke there, his own brother-in-law. Alongside the king were his wife, Emma of Normandy, and sons, Edward and Alfred. Aethelred's other sons, including Edmund Ironside, remained in England. The crown appeared to be within Sweyn's grasp, but he died in early 1014. The Danish cause, which was now less a case of them raiding and more a campaign to take the English crown, was taken up by his son, Canute. Soon after Aethelred's return, Canute hideously mutilated some English hostages that had been held by Sweyn. He cut off their hands and noses and dumped them on the shore of Kent. England was now moving into a new era. Aethelred's reign had been a long and depressing one, full of treachery, carnage, and blood. His life was coming to a close, and his long-term nemesis was dead. A new rivalry was emerging between his robust, energetic, and brave son, Edmund Ironside, and the equally talented Canute. It will be they who fought for the throne after Aethelred's death on the 23rd of April, 1016. Dogged by cowardice, treachery, and his own disastrous decision-making, the reign of Aethelred the Unready had been catastrophic for England.